Thank you, Linda. So I don't know about all of you listening in, but I am really excited to have IASSIST coming at us in September. We don't have to wait till spring in our very first webinar for the professional development series that we are launching. So very excited to be here with you today. Before turning to our speakers, I just want to make a couple additional notes to what Linda said. One is because this is a new webinar series, we are hoping to get more people involved in organizing this webinar series or involved in the professional development committee at IASSIST. So if you are itching for a service commitment, have passion to share, have ideas about professional development, have speakers that you would like to see, please email me at the conclusion of this webinar, and don't wait. And we will find a way to plug you into the planning work that's going on. Also, if you yourself have an idea about a presentation that you would like to see as part of this series, if you'd like to talk to your peers, we actually have a very large audience, I think over 60 people right now online already at this point, and likely more to come. Just again, shoot me an email, apienta@umich.edu, and we will find a place for you in this webinar series. If you have ideas about the kinds of things that you'd like to hear and you don't want to present yourself, again, just get a note to me. So, as I said, excited that this is our first webinar series. This particular webinar series comes to us from the QuishDig, you all know that acronym, I'm not going to even have to say it, interest group at IASSIST. They were our first volunteers to give the webinar. Specifically, as part of QuishDig, we have two amazing speakers from the Qualitative Data Repository at Syracuse University. We have Sebastian Karcher, who's the QDR Associate Director, and Desi Karolova, a data curation specialist at QDR, talking with you today. The title of their presentation is Teaching Qualitative Data Management Lessons from QDR. I'm looking forward to learning, and I hope you are too. Take it away, guys.
Thank you, Amy. And hi, everybody in the audience, wherever you may be based. We are very excited to be part of the new series and to be the inaugural presenters. Thanks to both IASSIST and QuishDig for inviting us and thinking about our perspective on qualitative data management. We decided to put this particular topic together, again, keeping in mind the audience and realizing in some of our conversations at the most recent IASSIST meeting that all of you are dealing with the demand for, teaching people, whether in individual consultation sessions or in group requests, teaching people how to do this thing called data management when it comes to qualitative data. And because we've been now doing it for a while and are getting, to be honest, more and more requests to do various versions of it, we thought there's some maybe tips and pointers that we can share at this point that hopefully will be beneficial to all of you. So very briefly, sorry, I'm trying to click to the next slide. There we go. Very briefly about QDR, in case you have not met either one of us or encountered that acronym before, the Qualitative Data Repository is hosted at Syracuse University, as Amy said, has been online since 2014 with various generous funding support by the NSF and most recently by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It serves social scientists across the world. It's really certainly not for Syracuse University researchers only, and not even for US researchers only, but people from around the world. We do extensive curation, and so that in that process even we end up training people who may not have realized that they needed to do certain things by way of data management during their projects. But our preference really is to be able to work with people who've had some training and who have given some thought to these topics before they started a project, as I'm sure a lot of you feel as well. Currently, both the depositing and downloading of the data projects that we have is free and done through individual accounts. We are in the process of instituting institutional membership. So if some of you at various institutions might want to talk about that, we can do that after, offline after the webinar in the future. We are all, or our staff are members of IASSIST and the new Kushtig interest group. Obviously, we have a lot of overlapping interests with that group. And as I mentioned, we are fielding more and more data management training requests of various formats, which is where this this topic kind of naturally emerged from. So one little description of what we're going to do today. These are the topics which we had already shared in the invitation for the webinar. But one thing I wanted to say is that, as you can tell, based on the 4 sections and the topic as announced, we're really not going to go into a whole lot of the content that we deliver at our training sessions, both because, again, we chose a slightly different angle to that content, but also because this is a fairly short amount of time that we have, and we do want to leave time for discussion and questions and answers that you might have. But a lot of the slides that we do use, the content-based substantive slides that we do use, will be shared with you as part of the presentation. So a lot of things that you would not see during the next 50 minutes or so are going to come to you when we share the presentation, and we hope that you'd find them helpful when you might have to do trainings of your own. So just keep that in mind. I will go into a little bit of the content points just to highlight some examples, but for the most part, this would be just lessons learned about how to approach teaching social scientists about qualitative data management. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so the first thing to begin with is the difference that we've discovered we need to sort of keep in mind and also explain to people about the difference between data management plans, which are often the requirements that make people approach, a social science librarian or a data repository representative with questions about what that is and what data management involves, versus data management as a process. So we find that first, with qualitative data researchers, a lot of these phrases that we take for granted, and even starting with the word data itself, are not intuitive and not natural, and sometimes provoke anxiety and reluctance. So the way to even start a conversation of that sort is to really adapt the terminology to the expectations and sort of the tone that the researcher might set in their request for your help. So we've adopted a wide variety really of phrases that we use interchangeably with data while trying to explain how they all do comprise data, in fact. So we call things empirical materials, primary sources, then more specifically, depending on the details that we might know about a particular project, interview summaries, focus group transcripts, qualitative notes, memos, fieldwork, ephemera, and so on. So, but just starting on the right with the right tone and matching the tone and expectations of the researchers, we have found makes a big difference in then how receptive they are to the rest of our advice and recommendations. The other thing, again, back to the point about distinguishing a data management plan as a requirement and as a specific document from actually doing data management during the course of a project, is trying to tell researchers, or trying to show them rather, how the best advice or the best practices advice that we're giving them is actually helpful to them. It goes beyond just checking off a box and meeting that requirement by a funder or a journal that might require a data management plan. And so these are some things that we've done, and we have found researchers to be extremely receptive once they understand themselves that what we're trying to teach them is actually helpful to their own work first and foremost, regardless of what exactly ends up happening with the data at the very end. And so we use, the familiar, to librarians anyway, the familiar metaphor of metadata as a love note to the future. We link that to the person that we're talking to, and we say it is a way for you to assist your future self, because you will have forgotten certain things and certain details by the time you come back to your data after collecting them to try to analyze them and write up things based on them. So do yourself a favor first and write yourself that, you know, love note to your future self. And then if you've done that, and if you have kept good records and clear documentation throughout the process, eventually, in addition to yourself or your team, other secondary users that you might choose to share the data with will also be able to make the most of those data and would be able to understand them in the way that you intended them to be understood. But in order for that to happen, you know, here are some of the things that you need to do. So document the data collection process well, and ideally in real time. That's a big point that we try to emphasize and hammer home. Organize your data sources in a logical way. Name your files meaningfully. You know, all of these best practices that we try to go into, again, are helpful to both the researcher and then any secondary users at the end. So in order to draw that distinction between the data management plan, as I said, as a specific document that often appears to people like an additional burden that they're just required to meet, that they may not understand the need for or the usefulness of, we link it then to the actual caring for the data in various ways and with various steps during the collection phase, and then during the organization phase, and potentially even during the analysis phase. But while making the distinction, we then have to link the two back together and explain that in order for you to do as good a job as possible conducting qualitative data management, you really should have thought about such and such questions in advance and documented them in this document called the data management plan, which is your own kind of commitment to what you're gonna then implement in the reality of the project. So draw the distinction by defining the two things as different, but then bring them back together and explain how they do connect with each other. Then another thing, again, as sort of preliminary things that we often try to do at the beginnings of our training sessions with qualitative data researchers is address head-on the concerns that people have, some of them very legitimate, about data sharing as such. So again, there's data management components that should really happen according to these best principles, regardless of what the ultimate fate of the data is. But as a data repository, we also do try to promote data sharing, and we don't shy away from that. But in order to make it reasonable and within certain parameters, in other words, we don't insist that all qualitative data can always be shared under no conditions. We do try to start the conversation about data sharing with addressing some of the reasonable concerns that people might have about that aspect. And so we're very familiar with the common concerns that people bring up. And so we, as I said, try to address them head on and offer solutions that do exist for a lot of those things. So just again, as advice for you, if you're doing a training session, identify which of these, and in some cases it's several, in some cases it's just one, depending on the person and the project. Identify which ones are the most relevant to them in their project, and try to find solutions together with the researcher. And then in addition to that, try to highlight for the researcher the reasons why it might be a good idea to share, because people are not frequently socialized in that concept. And so it's really our role, or we've found it to be our role, as coming from the data domain, not the social science domain, to highlight that there actually are benefits to sharing, both to the researcher who generated the data by way of making their work more rigorous and documented and traceable and so on, but then potentially to the research participants that they involve, and obviously the broader scholarly community and social science as a whole. So to bring that up as part of the conversation. And then link it back to, this is why it's important to do the data management part well, both plan for it, document it, and then actually execute it. Because data creation is likely to be expensive in time and money terms. Data underpin the researcher's published findings, so they want to create good quality data that then would if not equal, at least increase the chance for good quality research and write-up publications. There are very practical things that good data management can help with, such as protecting data from loss and destruction. And I think almost any researcher can easily relate to that fear. Then there's the compliance aspect with ethical codes, data protection laws, journal requirements, funder policies, but that's not a primary reason to manage data well. And then again, to benefit one's own future self. We have found interest, at least among graduate students, when we tell them that learning how to do data management well is actually a transferable skill that could take them and could help them in domains beyond academia if they choose to pursue something else after they, let's say, finish their PhD. So that's another reason that you may highlight. Here we go into a few, well, the topics that we do think every data management plan should contain. And as I said, I will only highlight a few of those, and you can find more content-based slides in the presentation that we're going to share after the webinar. So oftentimes, we, and I imagine some of you who may have done trainings, start with this very familiar image or some version of that image and the concept of the research and the research data lifecycle. So this is something that's very intuitive and almost second nature probably to most librarians or data information specialists, but not something that social scientists really would be familiar with. So what we try to do here, and Sebastian will talk a little more about that, is basically when you do choose to present that image, don't just leave it hanging there, because it may not be an intuitive one for a researcher to understand. Our slide that actually goes into what we recommend you do disappeared, but like I said, Sebastian will talk about that. Make it into an exercise. Ask people to imagine where they might actually intervene with data management steps. Then the whole concept of writing a data management plan as a document that may be new to most of the social science researchers who may be approaching you with requests for training becomes easier if you offer them some suggestions for resources that exist online. So maybe point them to the guidance that the funder that they are trying to satisfy provides on that point, or point them to the existing online tools that have a template that, as all of us know, isn't really necessary to use, but might make it easier for a person to sit down and actually fill out prompts and suggested questions, as opposed to sit down in front of a blank screen and not know exactly what to put in a data management plan. So start with those existing resources that they may be able to use. Here's where we go into the topics that really should be addressed by a data management plan, whether the researcher uses a template or just does a free-flowing narrative. The kinds of data that are being created for the project, the formatting of the files that is envisioned, data documentation, and here we can go into all manners of detail, descriptions, standards, metadata, data storage and security. As I said, that's a topic that most people don't think, or most researchers don't think about, but once you bring it up to their attention, are very cognizant of its importance. Then access and use, potentially, again, if the data are shared down the line. And then things like intellectual property and ownership or copyright of primary materials might come into play. Human participant constraints, which are very near and dear to the hearts of most people who do qualitative social science research. Roles and responsibilities in a team if the researcher is working with others, not by themselves. Budgeting for data activities, again, that may be something obvious to you that it should be addressed in the data management plan, but not so obvious to the researcher. So mention it, that it should be an explicit section of the plan. And then if data sharing is an applicable topic to discuss, what data sharing policies will be followed, and then the choice of where to share. So the few items that you see asterisks on here, I will touch upon again just very briefly to say how we found helpful ways to introduce those in data management training seminars. But overall, the whole point, or a broader point that I also wanted to mention before we go into those, is that the researcher shouldn't be left with the impression that they must know every single detailed answer on every single one of those topics. And in a way, even you probably may not know every single detailed answer to every single little topic that should be covered in the data management plan, but you should be the resource person that points that researcher to the existing maybe more specialized sources of information that they can turn to. So you know, maybe it's your role to tell the researcher preparing a data management plan that what they say on the topic of data sharing and human participant constraints should really match what they have said or what they're planning to say in the IRB form. So they really need to consult that local body as well while producing the data management plan. Then if they're satisfying a funders or journals guidelines, you know, point them to the specifics of those and think about how some of that detail provided there needs to be translated into the data management steps. Of course, relevant repositories that may provide additional sort of curatorial type of assistance to just provide the link to the researcher where you tell them who they may want to contact and find out more about, let's say, de-identification of data or what kind of technical access controls a given repository might offer. So be the liaison for your researchers. Then try to customize advice as much as possible based on the details of the project that the researcher will share with you. And then for specific scenarios, don't forget to use the listserv, both the IASSIST general listserv and then the new Kushtik listserv, where all of us can provide help to each other. Remind the so here I go into those few items where I had provided the asterisk. So when we talk about documentation, we find that reminding people to consider documentation early on is really, really critical, and that's kind of the argument that we build for them. The good documentation depends on what information the researcher can provide. What they can provide depends on what they can remember, and then remembering after the fact, as we know, is not nearly as efficient as documenting things and, you know, writing up in the form of memos maybe as they proceed with the project. So do it, you know, plan for your documentation from the beginning and then do it consistently, document things consistently during the project. Give examples when we talk about documentation. So here's some examples that we give from QDR projects, but QDR depository projects, but you know, you can use a variety of other ones that exist out there. So this is project level documentation, namely the data list. So each item that this particular qualitative researcher collected is logged into this spreadsheet that she developed, and then there are meaningful tabs that say exactly what the theme of the given items is. Same thing on the file level. So there could be documentation both on the project level and the file level. Here is something that, or somebody that did interviews with political figures, and they very thoughtfully included a little bit of metadata with each transcript, right? The date when the interview took place, the place that they interviewed somebody, who the person was. In this case, again, because they were political figures, there wasn't the need to keep the information confidential, but that was done in the field, and it was extremely helpful when the person was depositing the data at the end of the project. Now, here's a question that probably, you know, there are differing opinions on. Do researchers need to know what metadata is? We say that they don't really need to know, but you can give them a sense of what it is on a very high level. That it's basically very structured documentation, and for the majority of researchers, they wouldn't have to write things up in the format of any metadata standard. This would really be done by a repository or by a library, except they do need to provide the substance that then gets translated into that highly structured documentation. So this is sort of my answer to, do I need to know what metadata is? Because oftentimes when they see a DMP template, the word metadata is mentioned there, and it might stump them. But this would be my approach to how to make them feel more comfortable with it. Then make info relatable. So here, how we open up the discussion of data storage, data backups, and what to do if you the researcher, encounter request for data destruction, we start with a slide that has this image, which is, you know, an arresting image, and one that researchers can absolutely imagine as a nightmare scenario for their fieldwork. And then having made that relatable to what they might encounter in the field allows us to talk about, rules of thumb for backing up data, or how you want to have 3 versions in 2 different locations, and so on. On the topic of data sharing, especially when human participants are involved, capitalize on what qualitative scholars are already likely to do and to know about protecting their sources. Talk about the informed consent process as a negotiation between the researcher and the participant, where data sharing could be an additional part of the conversation that they hold, which might not have been the practice for many qualitative researchers until recently. But the whole, you know, or explain to the researcher how they can tell to their participants what various access conditions exist, even if the data are planned for sharing, how the storing of the data while in the field will be done securely. Like I said, you know, don't assume that just because the researchers are working with human participants and or sensitive information, that immediately, or don't let the researcher assume that immediately means the data cannot be shared. Capitalize on these considerations that they might already have and explain to them how thoughtful data sharing can also be incorporated in that. And then this was, again, just a little bit more content than maybe I have time for here, but talk to them about de-identifying the data after the fact, which again, they might already be planning to do partially for publication purposes, but it could be extended for data sharing purposes. And then the last substantive point from the many points that do need to be addressed in the data management plan, where to share if sharing is going to be considered. Discuss the different options. And here is where, again, from our repository perspective, we really hope that you can highlight for researchers why an institutional or domain data repository is the best place. The security, the curation, the various access controls that repositories can provide are, you know, above and beyond anything that a person who chooses to share on their own website, or even as a journal provided website, can offer. So here I'm going to transfer oh, sorry, I am reminded that there's a question box here. How do you typically recommend the metadata be stored? Separate files using qualitative analysis software? Well, so again, here, this would depend very much on the project and how familiar and comfortable a given researcher is with the whole concept of metadata. As I said, we typically approach this question, or the point about metadata, by telling researchers that we work with that they don't have to provide truly structured metadata, right? That they have to give us the answers to specific questions that we give them, you know, who produced a given file, when it was produced, under what conditions it was secured, whatever aspects of metadata we care about, we make sure that they give us the substantive information, but then we transform it into specific metadata files. I can imagine how that could be different with different projects or researchers, but I would basically ask them for a kind of a more free text documentation file, or the answers to these questions to us, as opposed to burdening them with, you must create the metadata. Sebastian might have a different answer when I transfer the mic to him and see if he feels otherwise. But when they do use qualitative analysis software, certainly some of that documentation can already be stored in there. That's perfectly fine, but I don't think that's a requirement, and depending on the project, it may not at all be a reasonable way to do it. So I hope that makes sense. But the person who asked, if it doesn't, and if you have a specific project in mind where what I said is, does not sound like a reasonable answer, we can talk about that further offline. Okay.
All right, and yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to that is to draw back to the slides that Desi already showed, that we generally recommend researchers to keep both file and project level metadata. So in many situations, a data list is a good idea, which kind of happens automatically as you're using in vivo type projects. And same with file level metadata. If you just use, Word documents, have something at the top. If you use in vivo files, make sure that you include that type of metadata in the software appropriate way. All right. I want to talk about two kind of perhaps even more hands-on topics than Desi's very practical advice. And the first one is exercises. And very briefly, I want to start out by talking to you about why do we care about exercises in the first place? Why do we think exercises are important in data management planning teaching? And the first answer is exercises work, and they work much better than lectures. This is on science teaching. It's a frequently cited study. So students that are engaged in active learning exercises, hand-on tasks in the classroom, are much less likely to fail their science classes. And the same is almost certainly true for data management. I would argue that's not the only reason, though. The second reason is that as you engage in exercises, the communication structure in your classroom, in your workshops changes. And often there is a lot of expertise on various topics in a room that you can learn from, that participants can learn from each other, and engaging them in exercises rather than talking at them for an hour or so is going to be a great way to take advantage of this combined expertise in your classroom. Thirdly, we find when people go to these places, it's often a really good way, good thing for them to take away something, right? They don't just come away with, being enlightened about data management planning. They actually have something in hand that they can then turn into for example, their data management plan. And this, what this image is, I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes. So let me give you some examples of what we do. And there is a lot of options of things that you can do in data management classrooms that depend on your audience, your time, etc. So we just thought we'd highlight a couple of examples that hopefully you find useful, that may give you your own ideas, that you may maybe adjust for your own purposes. So we've thought a lot about how we can get people to work on data management plans in the limited time that we often have for workshops. And especially if people don't come prepared, telling them write a data management plan or giving them kind of a fake data scenario and having them write a data management plan is not typically something that we find is terribly effective. The results are fairly formulaic, and especially as I think about qualitative data, don't really get home this idea that a data management plan is not, checking boxes according to some formula, but really needs to reflect the specific nature of the project. So the idea that we came up with is that we, instead of having them write or start writing DMPs, we have them assess DMPs. We tell them, well, think about this from a perspective of maybe a grant reviewer or an outside advisor. And the tool that we use for that is actually developed by a group that try to systematize how data management plans conform to NSF criteria. And they have all their materials on OSF, that's the Data Management Plans as a Research Tool project. And we use their data management plan rubric, where they describe that, and I'm going to show that in a minute, as well as a blank sheet to fill out that rubric. And then we give people sample data management plans. Now, where do you get sample data management plans? The Rio Journal That's Research Ideas and Outputs has some published. There are some public on the DMP tool site itself. If you get permission from researchers that you've worked with, that's often a great source. Typically, you'd use those de-identified. And then what we tell people, we break them into groups and have them analyze their respective DMP there in the sense of the one that we've handed out to them, have them do their own scoring, and then discuss the scores with their neighbors, focusing, and then with their whole group, focusing primarily on the points where they disagreed, and then we bring it in to the plenum and have everyone kind of discuss larger takeaway lessons. So often this might be things people really don't seem to think about data sharing, or people seem really unaware of this particular point, say the size of data, or depends obviously on the examples that you give them, and you may want to pick the examples so that you expect, to get to points that you consider particularly important. So this is kind of how a very small excerpt on this rubric looks. It really breaks the data management plan apart, and then for every category says, this isn't touched at all, it's kind of touched upon, but it's incomplete, and the person who wrote this plan fully hit this criteria. And there's a large number. I think there's like 20 something in the full rubric, but these are all open license materials, so you can also consider cutting them out. We find this is a very effective way for people to get talking about what makes a good data management plan, which in our experience, no qualitative researchers in our workshop has really considered before. And by flipping that script, they really start thinking, okay, this is a good plan. And they're ambitious people. They want to write a good plan. So that's a great way to get them talking. And they also are easily make the transfer from, okay, this is missing in the DMP I looked at. This is actually also missing from my data management planning. We find that very effective. Some additional thoughts on this: find the right DMPs. We use different quality levels in our DMPs. We have some really good ones and some bad ones to kind of hit on different points. Note that the rubric as developed by the START group is NSF focused based on their research program, which for us with a US heavy audience is great. For other people, maybe less great. And as I mentioned before, focus the group discussions on where they actually disagreed with the coding, which often brings out some of the more interesting points. Sometimes we get into groups with very different levels of preparation. So some people have absolutely no research project in mind. They're maybe too early on in their graduate career, first year, second year graduate students that are still really figuring things out. And so with them, we would do this particular exercise. But then some people may come with prepared DMP drafts, and there we just have them exchange DMPs in pairs and run the same assessment exercise. But there they actually get a peer review of their DMP, which, think back to this idea of giving them something to take away, is incredibly valuable. And then a third group is somewhere in the middle, right? They may not have started a data management plan, but they do have a research project, and there we really want them to start the process. We want them to leave with more of a data management plan that they came into. And the two things that we do there is we bring them back to the data lifecycle, and we tell them, take a blank data lifecycle and think about, how do these different stages apply to you? And what do you need to plan at the different stages? And what sometimes we'll give them an additional checklist to prompt thinking about this, but this is what this results in, and we really emphasize to them, this is your first draft, right? We want you to jot down lots of thoughts that you have, and this can be very informal, which is why we use this picture that UK Data has from the Pukuk project. But the point here is not that you read every word, but you get this idea. This is very hands-on and project specific. The other thing that we have them do, especially if they're a little further, where we introduce them to the DMP tool, we have introduced them to the local version. Those of you who are familiar with it will know that most probably research universities in the US has a specific localized version of the DMP tool that you can log into with Shibboleth. And then we start getting them used to that tool, again, with the thought they can save where they leave off in the workshop and have something to take away that they can use at home. A particularly tricky issue, as most of you who've dealt with qualitative data probably are aware of, is de-identification. There is kind of a myth that it's not possible at all, which we as a general rule don't agree with, and so we want to start training people, how do I de-identify qualitative data? One thing that we emphasize to them is that as a repository and as experts who've seen a lot of transcripts, usually, right, we're talking about interview or focus group transcripts, we have expertise, we can help you, but you are the one who has the deep contextual knowledge and will probably actually be the best person to do the de-identification yourself. What we give people is 1 to 2 page qualitative interview. We've using UK data from a study on antiretroviral drugs in Uganda by permission, but find anything. You don't need very long interviews. They just need to be 1 to 2 pages long. We give them the list that Desi earlier had on some general pointers to how do you de-identify qualitative data. And then we just have them spend 10, 15 minutes looking at this and say, what's maybe problematic, what would you need to change, and how would you change it. The one thing that I would highlight here is that a good result to get out of this, in addition to very hands-on advice, what do I need to de-identify and how, is this idea that the identification is audience dependent. Maybe if the data gets into the hand of a neighbor, they were going to be able to recognize their neighbor. But if you even put soft restrictions, say to researchers on the data, you can leave much richer information in the data. So this idea of a sort of a trade-off between accessibility and richness of the available data is one interesting lesson to get out of this. Stepping back a little further, we just wanted to end with a couple of things that we learned in the process of teaching this. I don't know, between the two of us, we've probably taught 10 or so workshops, maybe more by now. The first one is, you're not alone. Don't steal, but borrow ideas, materials, and then, if you think you've done something that's interesting, share it yourself. And given that most of you are probably librarians, I don't need to tell you how wonderful Creative Commons licenses are for this. The second lesson, and this has become kind of a truism, and Desi mentioned it a couple of times, is researchers don't react terribly well to being badgered. So if you tell them you have to do this, your funders want it, we want it, the journals want it, you probably get them to check some boxes, you don't get them to do good data management. So we put a lot of emphasis on this idea that the first person to reuse your data is you in 5 years. The next idea is that be very clear that you haven't always been a shining example of data management. This is actually by a graduate school colleague for me who uses it in one of his talks. He's now one of the better known quantitative reproducibility people, an exemplar of data management, but this was his dissertation. And the same is probably true for most of us. We all have examples of how we learned our lessons by disregarding the advice that we're now giving to the people that we're teaching. And I think this is important, right? If you can scare people away by making things seem like they're doing everything wrong and you've always done everything right and they're just being dumb about this. Failure in these things is common and it's okay, and if they can skip one failure by learning from other people's failure, that's probably nice. Sweat the simple stuff, right? So in graduate school, and graduate students are an important audience, you learn a lot of complicated things. You often don't learn the simple things. You don't learn what's a good backup strategy. No one talks about how to name your files. No one talks about simple things like creating a data list or like having a header in your Word files that describes interview or other metadata sort information. Stress these things because they're very easy, they sound trite, but they're incredibly useful. Slides are actually quite tricky, and we're still working on this. Visuals are incredibly effective on slides, and no matter what you forget, none of you will forget that there is a large rodent called a capybara in South America, and it has monkeys riding on them. But often you have you have all this material that you want to give to people, and you actually use the slides as something that people can take home later on. And these links and information, that's very useful, especially if you only have, one point of contact, one workshop. And so what we do is, in this case, actually what we preach is what we do is we just include those heavy text slides as hidden slides or as notes in our presentation, and then share the full presentation later for people to have a reference. But we try to make our slides as visual and as engaging as possible. And there's always improvement. We're constantly improving them, but that's where we are as of now. By far, the most common topic that we get asked about is about security issues. And most of us aren't IT security experts, but given the number of questions you're likely to get, I would recommend you develop a certain degree of expertise and at least know who else to ask locally, who people to point to, what local services are available, have an opinion about cloud services. Every graduate student will ask you about Dropbox or Google Drive. So you should have an answer to that. And that answer depends both on the nature of the data, but also on local laws. So if you're in the EU, you need to be much more careful with cloud services than in the US, where the data protection laws are somewhat more relaxed. Still, due diligence, and have recommendation on encryption tools. Some people will have good advice from IT folks on this. Some people will have no idea, and you should have at least these research, the basic concepts available. There is lots of IT security training online that you can find easily, and the ESF has a big toolbox, the electronic, blanking on the name, sorry. But take advantage of those if you're feeling insecure about this. Technology comes up all the time in data management. I find one of the best ways to stay up to date on technology is actually the workshops themselves. I talk to researchers all the time about what they're using, and sometimes I know about it and can give them tips about it, but often they tell me new things that they're using, and then I engage with them, learn more about them, maybe look up something in addition afterwards. But you will need to stay up to date on the software that your researchers use, because a lot of questions will be about that, and you'll be very popular if you're able to address those questions. And lastly, some lessons from our use of exercises. Exercises take a lot of time to do. You saw I had some time stamps in my exercise slides. Those were probably even on the short side. So plan enough time. If you have an hour workshop, you have time for probably one exercise, not more. Make the exercises right for your audience. Not every exercise works for every audience. Not every material used in exercise works for every audience. Not every exercise works. We have discarded some exercises after we found that they don't engage people, that people seem kind of, they're usually goodwill, they'll go through with it, but you get a good sense if people get something out of it and are excited or not. And even if you've put work in an exercise, don't get too attached, be willing to throw it out if it doesn't work. And then lastly, use the time of the exercises to engage with your audience, with your researchers. It's a great way to learn about what they're doing, to learn what they're most interested in, to improve your exercise for the next iteration of it, and so on. And that concludes our presentation of lessons learned. We probably have more than these, but let me look at some of the questions. So can I break this out here? Yes, excellent. So for de-identification, so this is Tumai from Odom, who I think asked / comments on this. For de-identification, we followed a process that involved 3 different people doing the de-identification to ensure nothing was missed. Is there a rule of thumb for how many rounds of DID should be done to minimize the possibility that the DIDs is complete? I think the standard rule, I think 3 is on the intensive side, especially if you're looking at the types of data collections that you'll often get from qualitative researchers. I think more common is 2. If you can do 3, that's amazing. But I think if you're thorough, 2 is good. Also, if you're coming from this as a qualitative repository, one of the problems is that not all transcripts you'll be even able to do this, right? Because we have a fairly international team here, so we cover about a dozen languages, but that's still a small number compared to the 250 or so in the world. So you'll just in some cases, you'll just have to give good instructions to the depositor in your case and talk to them. So that's the best I have on that. Do you break the DMP process into a series of workshops? I think that's an interesting idea if you have the right audience for that. We typically have one-shot workshops because the type of people that interact with us aren't, a workshop. There is a great, and this is on one of the resource slides that I've hidden, there is a graduate seminar by Amanda Whitmire who taught an entire semester-length course on data management. If you want to look at that, I think that's pretty sweet. And I think her evaluations on that, both in terms of outcomes and in terms of how student feedback, were excellent. So that would be on the DMP process. But yes, if you can take it apart, I think 2 or 3 sessions would be amazing. We usually don't have those. General durations of those workshops. We do anything from 1 hour to a whole day, and that really depends on how we structure them, right? 1 hour, one short exercise, whole day, typically 3 to 4 more extensive exercises, taking more time. I think you can get a lot across in an hour to get people started. If you have a whole day, you can give people a rock solid foundation that will serve them for their entire graduate and research career. Both are great. Do we offer DID as a fee for service? We offer de-identification checks as part of our currently free curation model. So we will read through and look over people's de-identification script, but we do not offer it as a fee for service. There are 2 reasons for that. One is that often we really believe that the contextual knowledge of the researcher is critical. There's just judgments that we cannot make, but also at a legal point, we keep the final responsibility for the de-identification with the researchers, partly because we don't think we can make the final call, and partly because our lawyers won't let us. So we won't just do it for you, but we will help you do it, and the researcher that you're working with, we'll check your work in detail. And then the last question before I think we get to 1 p.m. is who is your audience? Our audience most typically are graduate students and junior faculty. In what ways might you adjust the workshops or content exercise to accommodate students versus faculty, for example? I think graduate students and faculty are actually quite similar. I think faculty will typically come with more advanced projects. If I have a mixed group, I often make sure that the faculty actually that I take advantage of the expertise of the faculty that has written grants, submitted DMPs to granting agencies, etc. We've never had undergraduate students, so can't speak to that. I think differentiation is the other thing, right? If you get people writing DMPs, be aware that they come with different levels of preparation, and not the same exercise might not work for all of them. And I think I've talked so quickly that I've caught up with every single question now. Wait if someone comes up with something else. I don't know, Desi, did you have something else to add? Desi is happy with my answers. That doesn't seem to be the case. We are obviously both, we are happy to talk with people individually too. Our email is qdr@syr.edu. You can find us at qdr.org. So if you have questions that you think of later, please be in touch. We're always happy to talk to people. We also occasionally will do call-ins to people, seminars people teach. So if that might be of interest for you, be in touch too. And with that, thank you again to IASSIST and to ICPSR for hosting, to Kushtik, of course, too. And with that, thanks to you for attending, and this concludes our webinar.